The town of Fredericksburg, Virginia, has transformed from the scene of a devastating battle in 1862 to an outlying suburb of Washington, D.C. in 2017. A once peaceful, quaint colonial town witnessed the ravages of the American Civil War and its aftermath. The town of Fredericksburg transformed from a place of anguish and hard times to a city with a growing population, expanding industry and housing communities, and a place for the memory of the American Civil War to remain alive. Starting immediately after the battles that took place along the Rappahannock River, until this very moment, the town of Fredericksburg exemplifies the meaning of memory, memorialization, and preservation of the American Civil War soldiers and the ground that they fought on. While the ever-growing urban landscape is constantly changing amidst the streets and corridors of modern Fredericksburg, Virginia, the creation of the National Park Service site, and other preservation efforts, the memory of the American Civil War remains alive. As the Civil War raged in 1861, Fredericksburg geographically sat between the federal capital in Washington, D.C., and the Confederate capital in Richmond, Virginia. In this period, Richmond vitally supplied the Confederacy with industrial and military goods, but also stood as the center of Confederate independence. This region, along a 100-mile corridor, bore witness to several major Civil War conflicts, especially the armies that met in December of 1862 along the banks of the Rappahannock River. After Abraham Lincoln transferred leadership of the Army of the Potomac from George McClellan to Ambrose E. Burnside, the goal was to quickly defeat and rout Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia.
Fredericksburg is an important moment in the Eastern theater of the Civil War. It is a moment where Lincoln finally moves away permanently from George B. McClellan's command and tries a series of new leaders, first among them General Burnside, who will be in command of the Union Army at the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of '62. And it signals this new ideal behind the war, that it's no longer war simply for the unification of the country, but also war now for the abolition of slavery.
Burnside quickly moved his army to the median point between Richmond and Washington, D.C. This region geographically challenged the fast-moving Army of the Potomac. North of the town of Fredericksburg lies the fast-moving Rapidan and Rappahannock rivers, an area not suitable for crossing a 100,000-plus man federal army. At Fredericksburg and below the town limits sat the wide, deeper section of the Rappahannock River, only to be crossed by pontoon bridges.
Well, generally speaking, in the 19th century, river crossings are not something anybody looks forward to. And the Rappahannock tends to, like most rivers in that period, be very unpredictable. If it rains upstream or it gets it can be fairly narrow if it's a dry spell or suddenly expand. And so generally, people avoid crossing the rivers and try to use them as much as possible to anchor a flank or as a barrier against their enemy, which is one reason you see the Confederate position where it is. Crossing rivers, though, was more common in places like eastern North Carolina or the tidal parts of Virginia because it's unavoidable. So there is a fairly sophisticated pontoon technology available. They know how to work it. And so they lay boats and anchor them and then lay a plank road over it. And it's very similar to what they were still using in the Second World War.
On December 11, 1862, after waiting several days, as well as fighting several small skirmishes with General Barksdale's Mississippian defenders in the buildings and defenses of Fredericksburg, the Army of the Potomac crossed into the city, leading to a full day of unrest and destruction of the once peaceful southern town. On December 13, 1862, a large-scale engagement takes place past the town limits at Maurice Heights and Prospect Hill, leading to a massive defeat of Union forces and keeping the Army in Northern Virginia alive for over 2 more years of the Civil War.
As Lee puts his troops on the high ground outside of town, Burnside is left with this agonizing choice of having to attack high ground with Confederate entrenched troops on top of them. The result is a series of assaults against the entrenched positions on Mary's Height, and most famous among them obviously is always the Irish Brigade under the command of Francis Meagher charging. And the mythology of the especially southern states has it that it is an Irish Brigade of the Union charging against the Confederate Irish Brigade that repulses its Irish Union counterparts. Obviously that's not the case. It is a Georgia regiment that is stationed at that place on Mary's Height behind the stone wall, but it's not an Irish brigade. It has some Irish migrants in it, but it's not as Irish as those 4 regiments of the Union Irish Brigade charging. The end result of this battle forces the Union back across the river, and nothing happens. Burnside will try again with his infamous mud march a few weeks later to swing behind Lee. Hooker will try in May to do the same, but the front lines around the Rappahannock remain stagnant. It creates an interesting environment because within a small, relatively confined area, you have 4 massive battles taking place over the course of a year and a half.
During the American Civil War, the urgency to commemorate and honor the dead ran through the minds of Union and Confederate participants as early as 1861. By September of that year, federal national cemeteries sprung up for those who perished in battle. 5 years after the conclusion of the American Civil War, nearly 300,000 Union soldiers laid to rest in 73 national cemeteries around the United States. At this point, there's a transformation in how Americans memorialized and visited the sites and graves of fallen American soldiers. These resting grounds organized graves evenly and strategically placed roadways for visitors to find ease while visiting these cemeteries. At Fredericksburg, the act of commemorating the dead who fell in 1862, among the others in surrounding battlefields, started as early as 1865. Created in July of 1865 under the authority of the National Cemetery Act of July 17, 1862. By this year, the federal government allocated 8 acres of land, and in 1867, another half acre was purchased to prevent erosion of the slope of Maurice Heights. In 1868, all proposed land was purchased for $250 per acre, creating a large national cemetery on Maurice Heights in Fredericksburg. The actual construction of the cemetery began in 1866 and was completed in the fall of 1869 with a total expense of about $180,000. Initially, a picket fence surrounded the outline of the cemetery and grave markers were made of wood. Later, a stone wall would be built, with stone tablets replacing the wood grave markers.
The National Cemetery in Fredericksburg is a new development at the time, relatively new, because the United States actually had started national cemeteries after the war with Mexico and had created one on foreign soil in Mexico City in the 1850s. But the massive number of casualties as a result of Civil War battles forced a rethinking of how does the country deal with dead people, dead soldiers, men who gave their lives in the defense of their country. Since it was impossible for families to recover all the bodies, the body of the dead soldier became a federal item of commemoration, effectively. And the relationship between the country, the dead soldier, and the families shifted dramatically, giving rise to these massive new cemeteries. And many of the cemeteries we still have with us have their birthplace at the time of the American Civil War, when we needed a place to inter tens of thousands of Union soldiers. And it's important to note Union because it's only for loyal soldiers who get buried there.
During the years of Reconstruction, the town of Fredericksburg formed a part of the Virginia Military District No. 1. As the construction of the cemetery commenced, Maurice Heights offered occupying federal soldiers a landscape for a living. In 1868, Grand Army of the Republic Commander General John Logan announced the creation of Decoration Day, now Memorial Day, which was celebrated at the Fredericksburg National Cemetery. Starting in the year of the start of Decoration Day, African Americans from Washington, D.C., Richmond, and the surrounding areas celebrated and honored Union dead in Fredericksburg. Confederate veterans also wanted to remember and honor their fallen comrades. A graveyard was created by 1864 of fallen Confederate soldiers. The Ladies' Memorial Association of Fredericksburg was created. These ladies cared for the Confederate and Federal graves, and in the springtime placed flowers in their remembrance. Their main objective was the upkeep of Confederate graves, though. Their first meeting was on May 10, 1865, where they discussed the collection of money from varied Confederate states. By 1874, the Ladies' Association was granted the right to purchase and beautify grounds with graves, and also erect memorial monuments and tombstones for soldiers interred in those grounds. On Memorial Day, 1888, Major J.O. Kirby, a veteran of the American Civil War and now a diplomat, wrote about this special occasion.
On the morning of that Memorial Day, one never to be forgotten, and I would that my poor pen could record it, so that every GAR comrade in the land might become interested. The Fredericksburg Grays, a crack military organization composed of the young men of the town, fitly representing the New South, headed by the brass band of the town, escorted the 4 solitary Federals to the rendezvous of the Confederates. Here were found 81 old rebels in line to receive us. Instead of the guns they used to carry, each had a bouquet of beautiful flowers in hand. We were placed at the head of the little column. Captain Dan Lee, on behalf of some ladies, then presented each Federal with a beautiful bouquet of flowers, stating that the ladies of the town had, on this occasion, divided their offerings between the CS and Federal cemeteries. Under command of Captain Lee, we marched out the same old Hanover Street, or Telegraph Road, the band playing patriotic airs, followed by the 81 Confederates in gray clothes, armed with bouquets.
By the last decade of the 19th century, a company composed of Union and Confederate veterans began purchasing land to preserve and conserve American Civil War battlefields. In 1896, the contracting firm McDonnell and Musselman began creating a paved path under a $2,000 contract. This path was named National Boulevard and connected the cemetery to Fredericksburg by means of Princess Anne Street. The boulevard ran along the old Telegraph Road cutoff. During World War I, an extension of the road named Prussia Street was changed to Lafayette in the midst of the anti-German living during the war years. The town of Fredericksburg began a swift change, an early movement towards preserving a battlefield that witnessed extreme anguish and death. In 1935, construction began on the PWA land to create a state-of-the-art visitor center and administration building. The Works Progress Administration, the Public Works Administration, and the Civilian Conservation Corps all played vital roles in the creation and upkeep of the Fredericksburg battlefield.
What they then do is look at some of the historical sites, Revolutionary and Civil War sites, and talk about making them into not necessarily tourist attractions, but local tourist attractions, places that people can see their history, etc. Part of it is a morale builder. We've been through this kind of thing before and we've emerged triumphant. So there are a number of things going on, but the CCC pays these young men, puts them under the command of the military, who are very adept at dealing with large numbers of young men, and who have to be paid anyway. So that's another side to that. And they pay them money, but most of the money goes back to their parents or their families or somebody to support their children or brothers and sisters or whatever. And then they get a portion of it for cigarettes and whatever other necessities they may require, but because they're given room and board and everything, even though it may be under a tent. So using them to clear land that has had, particularly battlefield land that has had scrub trees and things growing up over it, and try to bring it back to something more like what it looked at the time of the battle. One of the problems that they did have was who was actually directing a lot of this activity and how much did they know about what they were doing. There were also not architectural so much as archaeological, but some architectural products, etc. The idea was to provide a living for these people while creating something of national worth.
After the creation of the museum and administration building, 2 years later, in 1938, CCC workers began forming plans, clearing land, and digging out the foundation for the superintendent's residence on the Fredericksburg battlefield. A year later, a more major assistance in the creation of creating 1860s looks on the battlefield began when CCC workers entered into their golden year at the park. The historic stone wall, most of which had been removed after the battle, began to rebuild the wall on park property. At this point in time, the only section of original stone wall along the sunken road dwelled off park property. So the men and boys of the CCC continued the section onto park property to bring the wall back to partial original length. The lead stonemason on the construction on the new section of the walls in September and October 2004 was Neil Rippingale, an authentic Scottish stonemason with the nonprofit Dry Stone Conservancy of Kentucky. Him and his team's work on the wall amounted to pure art. After 30 days of challenging labor to finish the third section of wall. In this region, the park was growing. The Fredericksburg area saw lots of growth and preservation happening in this period as well. Other National Park Service sites started to spring up, and with the evolution in preservation and management at Fredericksburg, many started to transform other parks in the same fashion. In 1940, Superintendent Spalding ran the battlefields at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania County, Military Park, Petersburg, Appomattox Courthouse, Manassas, and Richmond. While the battlefield parks began to evolve in the 1940s, global events slowed down the process of preservation, battlefield land purchasing, and visitor numbers. As the Second World War raged, the United States issued rationing on various items, such as rubber tires and gasoline. With the lower availability in these items, American history enthusiasts did not travel much from home, and the Fredericksburg battlefield, among other battlefield parks, witnessed a severe drop in visitor numbers. As numbers of enthusiasts dropped, military units utilized the battlefield to discuss war, military maneuvers, and challenges of battle. Doing this helped military minds as they entered combat in the European or Pacific theaters of World War II. With lower numbers visiting the park led to lower funding for staff and workers on the land. In October 1942, flash floods damaged the park profusely, and then a year later, in 1943, a summer drought dried the landscape, ushering in the death of foliage and the rise of fire hazards. Fredericksburg suffered during the years of World War II. During the coined quiet times, as Happel states, the park experienced low numbers in visitors, but made up with extensive time to do research and invest better information into their interpreted plans. This period of research and quiet times hoped to gather new information for after the war when business started to pick up. As World War II concluded, the park surprisingly did not return to how it was during pre-war years. As the country was moving away from a war economy, jobs and spending did not come to the Park Service. Financially and geographically, the Fredericksburg battlefield did not expand or grow. While this park suffered from governmental financial support, it did rise in park visitors. Before the start of World War II, roughly 7,100 Americans visited Fredericksburg. After the war, and by the time of the 1950s, close to 20,000 visitors came to the park annually. With more visitors, not just at Fredericksburg but other National Park Service sites around the United States, new visitor centers were greatly needed. By the time of the 50th anniversary of the National Park Service in 1966, a new initiative was put forward for new state-of-the-art visitor centers. Coined Mission 66, this initiative envisioned a new modern interpretive system that juxtaposed the traditional buildings and architecture of the era of the War Department and CCC. These visitor centers embodied new interpretive plans and information so that park guests experienced the most correct, up-to-date information on the site they were visiting. These new learning centers welcomed bigger restroom facilities as well as places to eat. The main purpose of this new visitor center would allow for enthusiasts to explore the historical exhibits throughout the museum, stop for the restroom, and potentially get food before embarking on a full day of exploring at the National Park Service site. This new Mission 66 plan also utilized the best measures possible to preserve, conserve, and use historic land in the best way possible. Fredericksburg Mission 66 plan embodied lots of changes, welcoming a wide variety of welcome centers to all aspects of 4 battlefields in its possession. Having these 4 separate battlefields challenged the officials at Fredericksburg. They said, "The difficulties at Fredericksburg stem from the fact that there are 4 parks rather than 1 to be operated in a community where population growth and construction activity have increased at a startling rate." Another large factor was the already stretched thin interpretive staff. Planners argued personnel contacts by qualified, friendly, and enthusiastic interpreters in the field are largely responsible for the internationally famous reputation of the service for quality interpretation. More exhibits were raised with detailed information so the staff would not be as stretched thin when explaining the battle. This Mission 66 plan ushered in a drastic look into the Civil War as a broad topic, but also at an individual level. With the introduction of these new waysides, exhibits, and interpretive plans, 4 topics wanted to be addressed. Number 1, an increased understanding of the course of the Civil War, Federal and Confederate objectives and strategy, and the part these engagements played in determining the outcome of the Civil War. Number 2, a better realization of the grimness and ordeal of these battlefields. Number 3, a greater sense of identification with the men and events of these battles. And lastly, number 4, a deepened pride in our nation's history and renewal of devotion to our unity and heritage. While the Park Service dealt with these new Mission 66 plans, which transformed interpretation at the park over the next decades, one large factor affected the original land that witnessed the fighting in 1862. As population numbers and industrial complexes grew in the town of Fredericksburg, original battlefield land became threatened. By the 1990s, the town was finally back on its feet financially and physically rehabilitated. As the thriving times rushed through the streets and neighborhoods of Fredericksburg, more and more people wanted to move in. Recently, Fredericksburg has been considered a suburb of Washington, D.C., and has seen tremendous influx of people moving away from the big city into this area of Spotsylvania County. There are several problems that plague the National Park Service battlefield at Fredericksburg particularly. While crossing the Rappahannock River from Chatham Manor, the view of the town looks similar to the 19th century. Several brick buildings from that period still remain. The problem lies past that, where Federals began their approach up to Murray's Heights. The area that Union soldiers stepped forward is now a posh housing development near the University of Mary Washington. This approach is limited, and it is not owned by the National Park Service. No markers to tell the story of what happened at that position during December of 1862. The second issue lies atop the crest of the actual Murray's Heights. While standing next to the stone wall and sunken road, the original open field of vision is now condemned to a thick row of trees. These trees are planted on purpose by the Park Service, since they remove the ugly views of urban sprawl and development in that sector of town.
The need in many cases arose for the preservation of these battlefields because sprawling cities of the Gilded Age had encroached on these. And in Fredericksburg, even though much of the encroachment there will be later in the 20th century, illustrates how devastating that can be. Following, for example, the march of many of the units that charged against the stone wall in Mary's Height, as you go along Hanover Street, you see nothing but housing estates, housing development, parks, sports fields, schools, city hall. But you don't get the feel of the open battlefield. So, from a preservation standpoint, Fredericksburg nicely illustrates the problems with the Antietam plan of small plots of lands being preserved, but you don't get the feeling of that whole battlefield anymore.
Today, Fredericksburg remains an urban landscape, a city that DC workers escaped to. But more importantly, the National Park Service site has survived since its very beginnings after the battle, when the men began to bury at the National Cemetery. The Mission 66 initiative formed better interpretive plans, which since the 1960s continue to improve. Not only do uniformed park rangers give battlefield walking tours, they also offer volunteer guides to alleviate the pressure of having a small, tight-knit staff. The park has fully completed the reconstruction of the stone wall at the sunken road, a full restoration of Chatham Manor, and its gardens across the Rappahannock. But they also display the importance of preservation and memorialization needed to remember those who perished during the Battle of Fredericksburg, as well as the other battles in the distant vicinity. The most important reason that the Park Service continues to put so much effort into Fredericksburg, as well as other battlefields in the United States, because they stand as living testaments to younger generations. So future visitors, rangers, or military members never forget the sacrifice of the soldiers that were made in 1862, as well as the remaining years of the American Civil War.